From the heartland of the United States and one of the leading children's medical centers in the world, welcome to the Children's Mercy Kansas City Pediatric Bioethics webinar series. We invite international leaders to discuss critical and controversial issues in bioethics. Now, from the Bioethics Conference Center on the Adele Hall campus, here's Dr. John Lantos.
Welcome, everybody, to the first webinar in our 2016-2017 webinar series. As always, we are enormously grateful to the Claire Giannini Fund and to Children's Mercy Hospital for funding these webinars. We have a great lineup already for the first half of this year. This Friday, 3 days from now, Perry Class, novelist, pediatrician, the person who invented Reach Out and Read, and a regular columnist for the New York Times on health issues, is going to be talking about her recent paper in the New England Journal about Tiny Tim and childhood poverty. She's going to discuss the new American Academy of Pediatrics policies about childhood poverty. And then next week, Vicki Foreman, who wrote an excellent memoir of what it was like to be the parent of tiny premature babies called This Lovely Life, will be here. That's on September 29th. And we have other webinars coming up. You can go to our website to check those out, and please join us for all those. For those of you who haven't been here before, I will introduce our speaker shortly, and then he'll speak for about 30 or 35 minutes. If you have questions or comments, look down on the right-hand corner of your screen. There's a little chat box. You can type in your questions there, and once Dr. Miles done speaking, we will read those out so that we can have a discussion. The webinars are taped, and they are posted then on our website. So without further ado, let me introduce Professor Steve Miles, a professor of medicine who holds the Moss Chair in Bioethics at the University of Minnesota. He is a prolific writer and author who's written about so many different areas of medical ethics that it's mind-boggling. He has a book on the Hippocratic Oath called The Hippocratic Oath, and then another book on professionals' participation in torture called Oath Betrayed. He's written extensively on end-of-life decision-making in medicine, on physicians and human rights. Over the course of his career, he's been a leading geriatrician and has also worked in refugee camps throughout the world: Thailand, South Sudan, Indonesia, and 77 other countries. So he could talk to us today about many different and interesting things, but what we've asked him to speak about is a topic that's raising a lot of questions for pediatricians around the country. It's the question of whether kids should still participate in competitive tackle football, and in particular, whether pediatricians should advocate for the continuing of these football programs or should advocate for shutting them down. Welcome, Steve.
Thanks, John. Pleasure to be here. John and I first met when he was a fellow in bioethics, and I was a newly employed and unqualified teacher for him. Today we're going to talk about school football and trying to advance the slides. Oh, slide, advance. I need some help here with the technology. So, if you could advance it manually from behind the curtain, please. I call upon the Wizard of Oz. Poof.
You'll get there. There it is.
Aha.
We're going
to deal with a bunch of objectives. Today I'm only going to talk about football. There are a lot of sports I could talk about, but we only have a little bit of time. And I'm only going to talk about school football, that is high school football. I'm not going to talk about the NFL. I'm not going to talk about college football because I want to focus on what's known for high school students. Can we advance 2 slides? Next slide. Now, It's important to understand when you approach this topic that there are about 4 million kids playing football per year in the United States. But it's important to understand that school football is only about a fourth of those kids. The other 3 million are in private programs such as Pop Warner or the USA Football League. So anything that's any intervention that is talked about with regard to public school football need not have any influence on a kid's right to play football. Next. And I would also point out that around 70% of those 4 million students are under 14. That is, these are the kids that are definitely still seeing their pediatricians. Next slide. We begin with the issue of the science of repetitive head injury, and that's going to be where the majority of my attention is. I'm not going to focus today on the question of orthopedic injuries. We begin with the idea that football is a collision sport, and collision sport's different than a contact sport. Now, dancing's a contact sport. To some degree, badminton is a contact sport. But a collision sport is a sport where collisions, particularly head collisions, are a routine part of play. And that includes football, rugby, boxing, hockey, mixed martial arts. It does not include baseball, for example, although there's definitely contact in baseball. But collisions are not inherent to the play-by-play action in a baseball game. And when you look at concussion rates, and we're going to talk about the fact that concussion rates are not a good way to look at this because of the issue of subconcussive injuries, you'll notice that even though hockey and football for boys have roughly comparable levels of concussion, that you got 50 times as many boys playing football as playing hockey, and so that the lion's shares of contact are off into football. Now, for girls, soccer is a area of contact and collision. Also, girls cheerleading and girls lacrosse, but I'm going to stick on the football topic today. But again, this slide counts concussions. It doesn't count subconcussive rates. And the reason it does that is because it counts symptomatic head trauma, not the asymptomatic head trauma, which is extremely difficult to locate. And for example, if you look at emergency department visits, you see there's a certain baseline level of emergency department visits for first contact of youth concussion. But you'll notice a primary care clinic is much, much higher. And the reason for that is that some of these kids are not recognized as having concussion or loss of consciousness or whatever right after they play, but rather what happens in the day or two after play. They'll have persistent headaches, and so they'll enter the system not through the ED, but they'll enter the system by going to their primary care doc. And so this gives you a rough sense of the underdiagnosis of concussion when you use emergency department or hospitalization statistics. Now, there's a difference between a traumatic brain injury and a concussion. A traumatic brain injury in the past has been thought to be something that reflects an acute physical brain injury, whereas concussion has been regarded as a low-velocity injury that primarily results in functional disturbance of cognition, and that basically, according to the past definition, that this was not so much a neuropathological insult, but was rather a cognitive function insult. With more extensive imaging, however, this view is changing. We're now able to actually see the inflammatory changes inside the brain, and so there's actually a substantial revision of this, a revision that also has resulted in the ability to detect subconcussive injuries using special types of imaging. Chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is the preferred term these days, is a neurodegenerative disease. That is, it is a cumulative insult. It is a progressive insult. It's always preceded by repeated brain injury. And what you have in there is you have this deposition of tau protein, which is this dark staining material, which to some degree resembles but is not identical with ApoE3 that we see in Alzheimer's disease. And there's a young onset of chronic traumatic encephalopathy that people feel is more likely to be associated with behavioral and mood disturbance, such as depression in high school kids, with relatively little motor and cognitive disturbance. And then the older onset is more cognitive and motor. But I have to tell you that that distinction is still somewhat tentative and has not worked out well in the literature. Now, when you look at high school players, and this is not NFL players, remember there's maybe 3 times, 4 times as many practice hours as there are game hours. And so when you count head hits per season, you're talking both the practice hits and the game hits. You're talking 200 to 2,000 hits to the head per season, which is quite a few. But when you look at the G forces that are involved, 20 to 100 Gs force with a maximum of 280 Gs. If you take a head kick in soccer, that is, bang the ball with your head, it's approximately a 20 G force. So this football deceleration injury is absolutely huge. And roughly 3 times as many players are now showing brain changes as experienced symptomatic changes. And this is a MR sequence at the top showing the kinds of changes you can see, which I'll skip through right now, except to say that this type of brain scan measures white matter injury. It's not a gray matter injury. It's basically relates to the torque that's applied to the white matter as the gray matter shifts back and forth over the lower brain centers. Now, this is an interesting study. This is an NFL study, but what they did here was they took 40 retired players, and then they did a really interesting thing to these people. They divided them into 2 groups: those who started playing football when they were under 12 and those who started playing when they were over 12. And then what they did was they did these fMRI injuries looking for white matter inflammation. And what they found was that the group that had started under 12 had more severe degree of damage than those who started over 12. Small study, but one that is actually holding up now in 3 separate papers. It's very hard to actually quantify head trauma. And I think this is going to turn out to be the best index to date. This is the cumulative head impact index. And what it does is it quantifies the injury by taking self-reported history, like seasons and positions, and then it takes impact data from accelerometers. And this impact data from the accelerometer includes both the rapidity of the acceleration change, but also takes the rotational acceleration as well. And what they found here is in a group of former high school and collegiate players that completed this, they found a dose-response relationship between the CHI score and more advanced age cognitive impairment and self-reported executive impairments such as keeping track of bills, that kind of thing, depression and apathy. Now again, all of these studies are small, and the problem with these studies is though they're small, they do keep seeming to add up. Now, this is another interesting study. This again is another small study, 24 high school football players, 1 season, no experience in clinical concussion. They had these helmet telemeters on, and then what they did was they did pre and post season MRIs. And what they found was that there was a very strong linear relationship between the impacts as measured by the helmet accelerometers and white matter changes. And more disturbingly, this study actually did formal neuropsychometric testing. What it found was that there was a correlation between the white matter changes and scores on the verbal and memory subscores at the formal neuropsych testing. Well, this is beginning now to go from a theoretical injury of the brain, which is possible to pick up by machine, getting closer and closer to cognition, which means that we're beginning to approach the question of the impact of high school and junior high football on the purpose for being in school in the first place, that is to get the brain better and educated. This is another fascinating study. Now, this one's a bit larger. It's 220 students who were at boarding school. And what they did was they first found that the number of concussions, they had worse attention and concentration. And they also disturbingly found that the symptom-free athletes without concussion, as opposed to those who came off the game and said, I have a headache, and they had a headache or photophobia for the next day or two, were just like the ones who actually reported the symptoms. And that they found that the GPAs were lower for the concussion than, and for those with recent concussion. And furthermore, you can notice there on the Trails B test, which is basically like a 1, 2, 3 drawing, you'll notice here that there is a dose response between the number of concussions and the impairment on the Trails B test. And you also notice that when there's more than one concussion, there is a decrement on the attention cognitive scale. So again, now we're beginning to link the question of concussion all the way over to cognitive function. Now, Anne McKie is a big student of this thing. This is pretty interesting. What she does is she looks at autopsies. Now, if you take just the high school players, and high school kids die for a lot of reasons that aren't related to football. They crash cars, they fall off of cliffs and avalanches and all the rest of this jazz, okay? But if you don't take the deaths of high school football players that occur in the context of a game, sudden death during a game, what have you, and just take the deaths of football players who die by other means, you see that in 6 out of 26 autopsies of that subset, you see a concussive traumatic encephalopathy in the football players, which is really pretty high and really scary. The NFL players, of course, are running closer to 80 to 90% up where the college kids are. And she, too, is a person who has totally ditched the language of concussion. She says it's not about concussion at all. It's about subconcussive injuries. The issue is repetitive head injury, whether or not it meets the concussion threshold at all. This is a kid who played football. This is not an argument by anecdote, but this kid, the family sued Pop Warner, and this is his autopsy. And for a kid who hung himself at 25, stopped playing at grade 12 in high school, to have very severe changes in tau fibrillary tangles in his midbrain is really, really scary, and not the kind of autopsy that we want to see in a young person at all. Although arguing from one case is not where I want to go. So then there's the question of game modification. Can we modify this game using heads-up practice or helmet design or something like that? Well, there's been a study of the various helmet designs, and you know, this is a Newtonian problem, Newtonian physics. You can change the helmet all you want, but you really don't change the inertia inside the head at all, and you can't, and it's no surprise. And so they do the study, and they found that you can't, there's no effect on helmet design. And it doesn't matter whether you use new helmets or reconditioned helmets or various designs, they're all the same in terms of concussion symptoms, symptom resolution, and time to play. This study is not, however, a study using any kind of imaging or neuropsych testing. Well, what about Heads Up? Now, Pop Warner has been advertising that Heads Up produces a 30% decline in concussion, and in fact, they're being sued for misleadingly advertising that. If you look at this substantial study with 2,100 in the control group and 1,400 in the Heads Up group, there was no difference in concussion rate among the young people who are using Heads Up tackling compared to non-Heads Up tackling, which doesn't surprise me at all. Heads Up, even though everybody from the USA Football to the NFL to CDC, NCAA, et cetera, is arguing in favor of this. All of these are industry groups. This is what the data shows, and this data is not contaminated by industry, and so you just can't go there. It's just not present.
Go over those numbers.
Yeah,
What is the control?
What the control group, you have basically 3,500 high school players, and 1,400 were in a Heads Up tackle program, and the rest were just playing everyday tackle. And then they looked at the concussion rates between the two groups, and there's no difference. That's scary. That's a large sample. Now we come to the American Academy of Pediatrics. As a geriatrician, I'm happy to talk about that. Dedicated to the health of all children. 1957, they said football has no place for kids under 12. Keep in mind that 70% of the 4 million kids playing football are now under 14. And then 68, they said unless the school can provide exemplary supervision, it should not undertake collision sports at a pre-adolescent level. Okay. In 2010, young athletes pose a unique challenge because their brains are developing and may be more susceptible to the effects of a concussion. Actually, that is an evidence-supported statement. And then last fall, removing tackling from football altogether would lead to a decrease in overall injuries, severe injuries, catastrophic injuries, and concussions. However, removing tackling from football would lead to a fundamental change in the way that the game was played. Participants must decide the potential benefits and risk. Well, okay. Did they offer any system to parents for assessing that risk? No. Did they provide any data for assessing that risk? No, they did not. And furthermore, it's interesting, they endorsed basically Heads Up. They endorsed a non-validated practice like strengthening your neck, but since they came out with this, the sport itself has moved towards flag football, and getting for the kids under 14 has moved to eliminating kickoff returns, spotting the ball on the 35th yard line to allow the game to advance without the collision of the offensive, high-speed collision between offensive and defensive sides, essentially rejecting the entire package of recommendations that the American Academy has done, with the single exception being the heavily touted Heads Up program, which has been shown empirically to not have an impact. Now, my big problem with this document is there's no template for informed consent. And they offered a bunch of non-evidence-based speculations. They paid very little attention to the data about football on school cognition. And after all, football is not an addition to school, it is in the school. And the question of why a kid's in school is not, particularly in K through 12, they're not in school for the purpose of playing football, they're in school for the purpose of getting educated. Something that seems obvious to me, but what can I say? So let's consider informed consent. The standard consent, my favorite statement in a real standard consent form was, there's a degree of risk in all daily activities. Well, that's amazing. True and useless. And also there's this hope on the part of nearly a quarter of parents, especially those from disadvantaged groups, that they can parlay a football game into a pro career, whereas in fact, 1 out of 2,500 high school football players will ever make it pro, and about 1.3% of NCAA players make pro, all those coming from the Class 1 leagues, none of them coming from Class 3 and 4. Most of these consents are not consents, they're simply liability waivers. Now, this would be another way to do it. You could say parents and students should be aware of preliminary evidence that suggests that repeated concussions and hits that did not cause a symptomatic concussion may lead to abnormal brain changes that can only be seen on an autopsy. And case reports suggest possible Parkinson's, ALS, severe traumatic brain injury, and depression that may be related to concussion history. This is the current consent form that's used throughout the state of Florida, a little bit closer to the mark. The other big issue here has to do with insurance. The medical insurance that kids buy when they participate in football is limited to injuries during the game, not injuries during the practice. And the insurers properly are claiming that the concussive head injuries are related to practice because there are 3 times as many practice hours as there are game hours. And so they're basically just paying off for fractures during regular games and writing off the entire practice season. The coaches can't detect these injuries, would be a relevant thing to put into consent. Brain damaging injuries don't have the symptoms of concussion, and insurance doesn't cover rehabilitation, durable medical equipment, or disability or loss of income. These would all be things that could go into a football consent. Social trends. I think it's really interesting. I get a daily updated search on this material. Tackle programs, particularly at the junior high and elementary level, are fading very fast this year. A number of the municipal and Y programs have ended. Quick-off rules have changed, as I talked about. Even the Ivy League schools now have cut the tackle practices by 2/3. Tackle practices in elementary school are being cut way down for the groups that still do tackle practice. And then there are a bunch of stronger rules for taking people out of play and also for letting them come back in. They're telling them they got to wait a week or so. My last count as of a month ago was the NCAA is facing 60 lawsuits. Pop Warner has paid on 1 suit, and since this slide was made, is now facing another class action suit. And individual high schools and state associations in Pennsylvania, Illinois, and Indiana are now being sued, which obviously has an impact on terms of how long the schools are going to do this. The insurers are backing away. The CDC is making new school guidelines, and the Academy of Pediatrics is remaining silent. If you look at a national survey of parents, parents are increasingly concerned. They're looking to the medical profession for guidance. They're very aware of this risk. Women and men actually are very highly worried about this risk in very young kids. And this is a situation where they're asking the medical profession for guidance, which at least the Academy is not providing. My proposal is straightforward and should not be misinterpreted. I think we should basically end football in public schools. That would not limit the right to choose to play football, because you can still choose to play football in the USA Football or in the Pop Warner Leagues, which is, 3 million players. But kids should not be given academic incentives to play football. They shouldn't be given time off from class. They shouldn't be allowed to get special tutoring by playing football. And furthermore, school physical education resources should be devoted to the kinds of activities that people use for lifetime physical fitness: jogging, aerobic dancing, bicycling, tennis, badminton, golf, I don't care. But people don't play football after they're out of school. The problem with football as a particular high school activity is that basically it reinforces the idea of spectator sports rather than participant sports, and it's not the kind of healthy lifestyle that we want to be using public school physical education resources for. As I say, we could eliminate football from the public schools to allow this issue to be resolved without affecting anybody's right to play. They would just be playing with out-of-school lessons, as they do now for piano, French, and base jumping, or even stock car racing. But we wouldn't be necessarily using school dollars to support this kind of activity. And so with that, I'll stop and take questions.
Very nice. I have a question.
Oh, yeah, great.
Thinking as a pediatrician here, it seems like the overwhelming logic of your argument would demand not just that you get it out of schools, but that you ban it completely as child abuse. Having 10-year-olds play football would be like having 3 million 10-year-old boxing gyms. The kids are allowed and encouraged to punch each other in the head.
Well, that's kind of a crusty argument, but I'll take that on. First off, football is unique in terms of the number of participants and the rate of injuries.
Mm-hmm.
It's unique in the degree to which it is a collision sport as opposed to a sport in which there are head contacts. Also, in hockey, the change in the checking rule has had a change in the game.
Mm-hmm.
Cheerleading is responding by changing the way the pyramids are played.
Mm-hmm.
Women's lacrosse is changing by adding helmets to girls, and since the stick hits in lacrosse sometimes are glancing blows off the top, they do not have the type of direct inertial impact on the center of the head that a football collision does. And finally, I just don't think you can eliminate all risks from people, but you can eliminate the worst risks. And I think that is fair. In some ways, pediatrics does it by suggesting, well, let's move the pop out of schools. But I'm not aware of any pediatrician which has suggested that adding sugar to your cereal at home or getting rid of kicks should be done as a matter of public policy.
Maybe my question wasn't clear. I wasn't saying you shouldn't get football out of schools. I was saying, why allow Pop Warner to continue? If 75% of the youth participation in football is outside of schools.
Because I think Pop Warner is going to be eliminated by the market.
Uh-huh.
Okay? And schools are a special, basically by schools what we're doing is we're devoting an enormous public infrastructure to structuring this activity and furthermore to incenting the playing of football at the expense of one's educational programming by all the incentives that we give kids who play football. Pop Warner, I think, the evidence suggests that they're losing members, and I think market forces will just take them out, and market forces this year, when the data's in, are going to show a huge shift over to flag football.
So we welcome questions either from those of you who are here or in the online audience. Let me just remind you, if you're online and you have a question or comment for Dr. Miles, that little chat box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen, you can just type in that question. We'll read it out, and we can have a little discussion with people from wherever you happen to be watching the webinar from. We have one online question.
Thank you, Dr. Miles. The first question is, would you be okay with flag football in schools to learn the skills? I've heard that some professional football players say they would not allow their child to play football, and flag football is all that they would do, even in high school.
I think it's too soon to tell whether it's empirically true that kids won't progress from flag to tackle. But on the other hand, I think that it's wise. A year without tackle is a good thing in itself. And so if flag is the way that happens, that's fine with me. Kids love to run around and play competitive games. I mean, whether it's dodgeball or whatever. I think that it would be totally fine to bring on flag and see what happens to the older progression to tackle. My guess is the kids won't go on to tackle.
Question?
Thank you for your presentation. I'm the mean mother of a hulk of a 16-year-old who won't let him play football and has been really approached multiple times.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm the mom of a hulk of a 16-year-old who I won't let play football and have really been.
I've taken a lot of heat for that. So
Yeah.
I've taken a lot of notes, and I feel very good about my decision.
I will talk to you and repeat your question. You are the very mean, unacceptably mean, Geneva Convention violating mean mother of a 16-year-old who's large and wants to play football and you won't let him. That's kind of what parents are for, you know. I got things I won't let my kids do. And
really, I was repeatedly pressured by the coach.
yeah, well, I mean, the interesting thing about coaches is, first off, the coaches are downplaying the data. But the other interesting thing when you take a state like Kansas or rural Minnesota is what's happening is that particularly in the small schools, the team benches are getting so shallow that they're asking the kids to play offense and defense, which basically exposes them to many more head hits. The other thing that's so interesting is that once you have a head hit in a game, you're approximately 3 to 5 times more likely to get a second hit in that game, simply because you're not playing up to par. So stand your ground, Mom, and offer the coach to take the entire team over to watch the movie Concussion.
Go ahead.
That's one other question. On your slide, your heads up slide, you talked about the industry groups and you included the CDC in there. Do you consider the CDC to be an industry group?
That's a fascinating question, and I did include the CDC because I listed all of the groups that are attached to the heads up guidelines. And I think that it's fascinating when I look at the CDC, which is heavily promoting the heads up program. I can't find on that site any empiric evidence that they are citing with regard to the efficacy of heads up. None, which is a little unusual for the CDC. Now, it is not uncommon for federal agencies, including, for example, the FDA or EPA, to have their policies and recommendations bent by industry. And I think that this is probably, when it's all done, will turn out to be one of those. Keep in mind that the entire set of literature on concussive encephalopathy was initially shaped by a set of false studies that were inserted into the Journal of Neurosurgery by the NFL. And in fact, the NFL lawsuit is now coming apart as those papers are moving through the retraction process and will probably be re-adjudicated. And to that extent, I think that the CDC has been improperly swayed by industry. And in the American Academy of Pediatrics, they did not offer any evidence-based evaluation of the Heads Up program at all. They simply referred to its endorsing agencies, which basically is using something by the endorsing agencies, I think, is improper. They should be better than that.
Is there any evidence that the CDC is taking money or
No.
No.
But, you take, for example, FDA, the business of FDA panels having pharma reps on them and coming up with reps on drugs is one issue. I don't know why the CDC did this, except I'm struck by the fact that in their Heads Up program, there's no empirical data, which is very unusual for CDC. Yeah.
We have a couple of audience questions. The first one being, first a comment, thank you for the very informative presentation. And some proponents of football will emphasize the positive qualities of team building and collaboration as a benefit to the sport. How would you respond to parents with those comments?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. The question has to do with team building and team spirit activities of football. I don't think those are unique to football, and I don't think they have to be unique to football. They're covered by a bicycle race, skeet shooting, tennis matches, golf. Team building and team spirit can be taught by a variety of activities. Furthermore, the very fact that American football is so unique to the United States rather than played in other countries also suggests this is a unique activity that's not put in our genes. But I think a more useful historical precedent has to do with the centrality of boxing in school and college programs of the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and up till, as I recall, 1963. And in 1963, at the NCAA boxing championships, a young man from Wisconsin went down with a hit to the head and died the next day. And what the NCAA did at that point was entirely cancel out boxing, and it took 15 years for it to reemerge. The NCAA could exert that kind of leadership again on tackle football, ending the league play, and let this redevelop for school use after a respite while we sort out the data and the protective measures. But team spirit, gosh, you can solve team spirit with a swim race.
So I have another question from another participant, which they ask, by eliminating a sport at school but keeping it in the community, that might lessen the supervision and regulatory oversight, may also prevent kids of lower socioeconomic status to have the same opportunities, for better or for worse, to participate in that sport.
I don't think there's, the question is whether moving it into the community would de-democratize the activity. First off, the number of football scholarships that are offered by by Pop Warner and USA Football are really quite high because the leagues view them as a place for training, conditioning, and selecting future athletes. And in fact, many of the pro athletes actually come through the Pop Warner system rather than come through the school programs. So I don't think that that is true. It is possible, however, that with time we're going to see football follow the arc of boxing and become a sport that people with more disadvantaged social class pursue. But to that extent, I think particularly in the young people, we should assure them, because it is true, that the chance of getting college scholarships is exactly the same for non-football and football playing students. And furthermore, even though we pay professional football players enormous salaries, the average career for a pro career, the average length of a pro career is a little over 3 years. And to take a 1 in 2,000 chance for a career lasting 3 years is really not the kind of decision that we would consider for any other vocational program.
Remind you, if you have questions, type them in that chat box. Talk to me a little bit about how political change happens here. I mean, you suggested a couple of different ways that football, or high school football at least, could die a peaceful death. One would be mean mothers don't let their children play, and you presented some data about how many parents are concerned about this. So parents could not shut down the program, but by not letting their children play, essentially let it die of apathy. A second would be that the schools themselves take a sort of responsible, accountable political decision, which in most cities with thriving football programs would take enormous political courage. Or a third would be through lawsuits. Which of those do you think is the most likely for high school programs?
I think they're all happening. I think the mean moms, though, are in the vanguard. And it's actually, since I collect these news articles, I love these news articles. There are a lot of coaches right now who are complaining about being beaten up by mean moms, which is kind of like, oh, really, you whiny guy. But so there's that. And you take Maine, for example, they've just lost 7 small teams. A team, I believe it was Ohio, shut down after 1 game because they had 2 players injured, and that meant their bench was no longer deep enough to get all the way through the season, and so they canceled their whole season. Now, in a league play, to have a team drop out, that means that the entire league schedule has to be redone, okay? You're seeing school districts merge their teams in an effort to keep them going, and what this means is the total number of games in the district or region is decreased as these teams consolidate. But also what it does is it removes some of the school spirit incentive because it's no longer Apple High School or Pear High School. It's Apple Pear Combined High School, and so the team spirit itself becomes less of a draw. And also you have the busing issues, which are much more complex. I think the lawsuits are going to become an issue. The non-insurability of it's going to become an issue. But I think the real issue is that we're going to see the entire under 14s shift over to flag, and we're not going to see these kids go on to play tackle later on in their school careers.
So the states you cited make me think that this might be a red state, blue state issue. I mean, Maine is shutting down their programs. Ohio's a toss-up. Are there any schools in Texas shutting down their programs?
Well, first off, as you know, Kansas had a large newspaper article about a case in Kansas. And as I recall, there was a Kansas team in a suburb here that shut down about 8-9 months ago. And so, yeah, there's probably a red state, blue state issue here, and certainly the infrastructure we built into football is probably much more extreme. I mean, you got a town in Texas just is building a $60 million stadium now, and the town next door was feeling so inadequate they've announced a $70 million stadium. But
Were there high school programs?
But on the other hand, Texas is one of those states which builds a lot of infrastructure they feel sorry about and have to tear down, and so they're going to have to eat it someday.
I have a question from the audience.
Yeah.
They thank you for your presentation, and then they mention, after going over the risk associated with playing in schools particularly, why do you think the AAP does not have a clear message regarding participation of football?
The question about why the AAP A, messed this up, and B, continues to mess it up, I think is an interesting one. And I'm going to tell you right off that I am not privy to any academy discussions. I'm going to make some guesses. First off, the report was written by people with sports teams affiliations. And secondly, as the report cleanly states, there was a conceptual bias in the report to preserving the culture of football. And so it was not the risk-benefit ratio to the individual students which was an issue, but it was the preserving the culture of football itself, which became an offsetting medical benefit. Now, to my mind, dedicated to the health of all children is incompatible with putting the culture of football on the balance scale. And I think that was a fundamental error. And once you are committed to preserving the culture of football, then the medical balancing, a fair medical balancing, does not come into play. The second problem I think that the AAP had, the third problem besides the people writing it were skilled physicians, but nevertheless attached to sports, to collision sports teams, and this culture issue, is that the AAP considered sports injuries in a manner that was dissociated from academic performance. And while it is fair to consider injury rates dissociated from academic performance for non-school attached activities, to do that to school attached activities, I think, is an improper framing, especially when it comes to the brain. Anybody can go through life with a fused ankle and essentially do anything, You can't do anything with a bad brain. And you can't choose a career. It affects your marriages or relationships, everything. And I think to not put the academic life into play on a school football was a fundamental framing error in the report. Yeah.
I have a question. You haven't talked about some of the non-concussive risks that relate to shorter lifespan, particularly some of the athletes that offensive linemen, et cetera.
Yeah.
And so is that part of your argument as well, or?
Well, the reason I don't talk about them is the non-concussive injuries is, first off, non-concussive injuries like torn ligaments and broken bones happen in such a huge array of sports: downhill skiing, extreme skateboarding, and all the rest of this jazz. But the second thing is that the disabilities, if not transient, are at least not pan-life disabling. Again, a brain is a special gateway organ to all of life's social and vocational opportunities. A femur isn't. And so if my femur falls off, I'll be in a wheelchair, but John will still take pity on me and get me down here to give a talk every now and then. Right?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
All right.
Not even pity. I would admire you. Yeah, go ahead.
More questions from the audience. There are a lot of movies showing successful lives of high school footballers, which gives both children and parents a view that it can eventually become a career. What role should media play in this issue?
Well, the media, I think, has taken a corrective with regard to the film Concussion, and now there's a kid book, too, that talks about concussion. I think the reason that we have this entire heroic genre of movies aimed at adolescents succeeding at football, this is an important genre of culture, and I'm not going to diss that. But I think that makes it all the more important for pediatricians then, as they discuss the football choice with parents, to talk about the practical likelihood of going from junior high or high school football to a pro career. It's really a very, very long shot. I forget the movie of the big guy with the little blonde.
Rudy?
Blind Side.
Rudy? Oh.
The Blind Side?
Yeah. I mean, you can do that, but I'm not going to take apart culture. I'm just going to say pediatricians should address it in informed consent.
So if the AAP this is another question from our audience, if the AAP is not willing to take a very firm stance, does that mean that the responsibility falls on the individual practitioner to ask and educate parents, much as they do about the risk of poisons in the house or excessive screen time?
Yeah, I don't know if you have to do a routine screen like do you have a latent football player in your house, but certainly if you have a kid come in for a football exam, you should be capable of handling that exam. That's part that families come to you for lifestyle questions. And given the poor data from the AAP and the lack of data from the CDC, I think that papers like those by Catherine Baczynski, Bachy, INSKI, in the New England Journal of Medicine are an important corrective to the lack of objective risk-benefit analysis coming from cheerleaders for the sport.
Have another one?
All of a sudden I do.
Okay.
Interestingly enough, and this person that's commenting mentions that Baczynski that you just mentioned, who wrote an editorial, which also took the AP to task. But she seemed to suggest that instead of an outright ban on football, the AAP should strongly recommend against tackling. Do you think that is enough?
Well, the effect of her recommendation would be to take us over to flag, which would preserve many elements of the sport, including team play. And I don't have objection to that. I mean, the problem that I'm talking about has to do with concussive injuries. I think eliminating the kickoff return and shifting over to flag would have a gigantic impact, and considering that the exposure zone here is 4 million kids' seasons per year, if we were shifted over to flag, I think we'd have a huge advantage.
Although school football, you said, is 1 million.
1 million.
3 million of the 4 are.
Yeah, but even the flag shift within Pop Warner, Pop Warner is probably going to take us 3 million. I would imagine over the next 3 years, we'll put 1 million of those at least into flag.
I assume you think once people turn 18, they should be free to do whatever they choose with their bodies, regardless of the long-term health consequences.
They can smoke if they want.
Yep. Or play college football.
Whatever. I mean, when you've got 70% of the kids under 14, these are not people who are competent decision makers. Mm-hmm. And the reason we have parents is to structure competent decisions for them.
We are going to need to wrap it up, but thank you everybody for joining us for this first webinar of the year. For those of you who are in the Kansas City area, Dr. Miles is going to be presenting a similar talk tomorrow at the Children's Mercy Hospital Clinical Advances in Pediatrics Conference, which is out at Children's Mercy Sporting Park. Is that really what it's called? At the new conference center out there, and that's going to be all day tomorrow. Dr. Miles is speaking around 11 o'clock, so if you want to hear more about this or hear the response of general pediatricians in the Kansas City area, which should be fascinating, come on out to Children's Mercy Sporting Park tomorrow morning for the CAPS meeting. There are still places, and you could still sign up online. Perry Class, our next webinar guest, will also be speaking at the CAPS conference. She'll be talking about health literacy and reach out and read programs at that conference. And then on Friday, will be joining us here to talk about Tiny Tim and childhood poverty. Once again, thanks to the Claire Giannini Trust for generous financial support for this webinar series, as well as Children's Mercy Hospital, which supports this series and our Bioethics Center. We'll see you all on Friday.